Chronicon Mundi.
Dive deep into history.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take those crucial turning points in history, give them a little twist, and then see what the most rigorous analytical tools tell us about the forces that, really shape our world.
And this time we're using some pretty sophisticated counterfactual models. We've got analyses from 4 different AIs here.
That's right. And this isn't just historical fiction.
Not at all. We are using the tools of realpolitik, of institutional economics, to move beyond just telling a story. The goal is to understand what foundational choices determine whether a nation, succeeds or inevitably fails.
Absolutely. And today we are diving into what is arguably the single most definitive crucible of American identity.
It's the Civil War.
The Civil War. A conflict that cost 620,000 lives. That's about 2% of the entire U.S. population at the time. It was the event that violently settled the question of whether the United States was a permanent union or something else.
And most critically, it settled the fate of 4 million enslaved human beings on this continent.
Exactly. So the core question for our deep dive today is, well, it's simple, but it's profound. What happens in an alternate world where the Confederate States of America actually achieves independence?
And the AIs have simulated this out for us. We're talking 160 years of alternate history.
We're going to analyze how that deep structural split, a North American continent divided into 2 ideologically opposite nations, one abolitionist, one founded on slavery, would have just reverberated across history.
And the outcome, according to these scenarios, is not a simple, clean separation.
Not even close.
Far from it. The immediate inescapable outcome is the creation of a really unstable 2-state system right here. And the border between them isn't friendly. It's an ideological fault line.
A true Iron Curtain.
It becomes highly militarized from the moment the ink is dry on the treaty. And that, right there, sets the stage for a century of conflict.
Okay, let's unpack that crucial first step. In our timeline, the Confederacy faced these staggering disadvantages.
Oh, overwhelming.
You had 23 million people in the Union versus the South's 9 million. And you have to remember 3.5 million of those in the South were enslaved and actively hostile to the cause.
And the industries.
The North had vastly superior industry. It produced something like 90% of all national manufactures, 32 times the armaments. So given all that, how does the South realistically win?
This is the first critical insight from the models. Victory for the CSA does not require marching on Washington, D.C. It doesn't mean forcing a surrender.
That was never going to happen.
Never militarily feasible, no. It just requires the political exhaustion of the North, the collapse of the Union's will to keep fighting. And, historical analysis shows they got dangerously close to that in 1864.
So the tipping point has to be this combination of unexpected Confederate military success and some kind of massive diplomatic catastrophe for the North.
Precisely. The models all start by altering a real-world powder keg, the Trent incident of November 1861.
Right. In our history, the U.S. Navy illegally boarded a British mail ship, the Trent, and captured 2 Confederate envoys.
A huge violation of international law. It caused a massive crisis. But President Lincoln, he wisely diffused it. He released the envoys. I think he famously said, 1 war at a time.
But in this alternate timeline, Lincoln doesn't back down.
Yeah.
The crisis is. It's not resolved peacefully.
No. In this timeline, maybe the political pressure from hardliners is too much, or maybe Britain just decides to press the issue harder. They see an opportunity.
An opportunity for what, exactly?
Well, you have British indignation, this outrage over the insult to the Royal Navy, but that combines with some very powerful self-interest. They needed cotton desperately, and maybe more importantly, they wanted to weaken their emerging global commercial rival.
The United States.
That burgeoning industrial power.
Yeah. Okay, so that foreign recognition, it still needs some kind of military event, right?
Yeah.
To give them political cover to intervene.
And the models are very specific here. British recognition follows a decisive, undeniable military victory by Robert E. Lee, specifically in the 1862 Maryland campaign.
Which in our timeline was the Battle of Antietam.
The Battle of Antietam,
right,
which was a bloody draw, largely because Lee's vital battle plans, his Special Orders 191, were accidentally lost and then found by Union troops.
So in the counterfactual,
those orders are not lost. Lee achieves the total surprise he was planning. He routs the Union Army, and suddenly Confederate forces are menacingly close to Philadelphia, maybe even Washington.
And that successful invasion, that's the proof of viability Britain was waiting for.
That's it. The Confederate military suddenly looks powerful. Like, it can hold off the Union indefinitely, and that gives London the political cover it needs for formal diplomatic recognition. And that's the moment the conflict goes international.
And once Great Britain acts, the rest of Europe follows.
Immediately. Recognition by London is followed by Paris. I mean, Napoleon III, he had his own imperial ambitions down in Mexico. A fractured North America serves his goals perfectly.
So what's the immediate effect of this joint British and French intervention?
The Royal Navy. British naval power is brought to bear, and they effectively break the Union blockade.
Which was the North's key strategic advantage.
It was everything. It was strangling Southern commerce. Now the North is suddenly facing a potential war with Great Britain over Canada and on the high seas. Its resources are stretched to the breaking point.
And that feeds right back into the political exhaustion you mentioned.
Precisely. If the Union can't take a major prize like Richmond, or more critically, Atlanta, before the 1864 election, the domestic pressure becomes overwhelming. The war just seems unwinnable.
And so the inability to get that decisive victory means Abraham Lincoln loses the election.
That's the political tipping point. A Democratic Copperhead candidate, someone running on a peace platform, maybe a figure like George McClellan, but with a clearer anti-war mandate, he wins.
And his mandate is to negotiate an immediate armistice,
which is formalized as the Treaty of Washington in 1865. The war ends, but it instantly begins a continental Cold War.
It's a peace built on sand.
Absolutely. The treaty formalizes CSA independence, but it leaves all the critical questions unresolved. The fate of border states, the status of the West, fugitive slaves. Nothing is settled. It's a pause button, not a peace treaty. Both sides just use the time to rearm.
Wow. What's fascinating here is that the defeat, it just fundamentally rewrites the North's identity.
It forces the United States to see itself not as this, preordained continental union, the whole idea of manifest destiny, but as a hard-fought industrial fortress that's under perpetual siege.
The sources suggest this causes a national trauma, something deeper than Vietnam. It's like a catastrophic internal betrayal mixed with an international conspiracy.
And that trauma immediately leads to radical political action. The Republican Party either radicalizes into extreme nationalism or it's just swept away by new movements demanding reconquest, remilitarization.
The idea of manifest destiny is just gone.
Shattered. The U.S. is forced to see itself as this fortress of freedom, surrounded by an autocracy to the south and a hostile British power to the north.
And constitutionally, they learn a very harsh lesson.
A brutal lesson. The Constitution is quickly, almost ruthlessly amended. The goal is simple. Centralize federal power to prevent any future secessions. Any ambiguity that allowed the crisis to happen is just eliminated. The Union becomes much more unitary, focused on military and industrial efficiency.
Now let's talk about the border itself, the Mason-Dixon line. In this timeline, it becomes a true Iron Curtain.
It becomes the most fortified zone in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, you have to imagine the border between East and West Germany, but stretched over thousands of miles.
And with this intense ideological hatred.
Exactly. It's a network of permanent garrisons, checkpoints, forts, almost like a trench system, designed to stop invasions or, more often, cross-border raids.
And what does that do to the economy? I mean, trade between the two.
It's strangled, completely suffocated by punitive tariffs and these exhaustive mandatory searches for contraband and, most critically, for fugitive slaves. This state of economic hostility defines their relationship for the next century.
The trauma also plays out in those contested border states. What happens to places like Kentucky and Missouri?
The partition is incredibly traumatic. For Kentucky, the model suggests it joins the CSA after these plebiscites that are marked by paramilitary intimidation, so the planter class gets its way.
And that makes the Ohio River the new front line.
A very volatile one. And Missouri is even more complex. It doesn't cleanly join either side. It just fractures into this decades-long, low-intensity internal civil war.
Just a perpetual low-boil insurgency.
That's a good way to put it. It prevents any real development and just makes the state perpetually violent.
And what about West Virginia, which, broke away from Virginia to stay in the Union?
It becomes a disastrous strategic salient for the Union, a long, vulnerable finger of territory that's almost impossible to defend.
And the CSA never recognizes its legitimacy.
Never. They view it as stolen territory, which makes West Virginia a perpetual tripwire. Any minor incident there could escalate into a full-scale continental war.
This section deals with the core contradiction, the millions of people held in bondage. What does the analysis show about how the CSA manages this zombie institution, as the sources call it?
It's grim. The analysts are unanimous on this. Slavery would have continued for decades, if not longer, and it's called a zombie institution because, contrary to the old argument that it would have just died naturally, it was incredibly adaptable and immensely profitable.
Can you contextualize that profitability for us?
Sure. In 1860, the capital invested in enslaved people was valued at $3 billion.
$3 billion. In 1860 dollars.
Right. To put that in perspective for you, that was more capital than all the factories, all the railroads, and all the banks in the North combined.
Wow.
You don't just willingly dismantle an asset that vast. The planter elite were not going to vote that investment out of existence.
So the profit motive drives its evolution, not its death.
Exactly. But they can't keep calling it chattel slavery indefinitely. The international pressure, especially from their British allies, would force a change in name, at least.
So they transition to something that sounds different but is functionally the same.
They transition toward neo-feudal systems. Things like servitude by contract for life, where debt is perpetually inherited, or formal debt peonage enforced by the state. The label changes from slave to serf, but the lack of mobility and political rights remains absolute.
And this servitude expands beyond the cotton fields.
It has to. The CSA desperately tries to industrialize to keep up with the North, so you see the expansion of industrial slavery. Enslaved people are put to work in the most dangerous jobs: coal mines, iron foundries, railway construction.
And the hiring out system becomes the mechanism for that.
Yes. The system where owners rent their slaves to corporations or the state becomes widespread. It makes the institution even more deeply intertwined with the machinery of government and big business.
And to hold this all together, you need a new constitutional foundation.
They have to. They adopt an explicit, codified caste system based on James Henry Hammond's mudsill theory.
The idea that civilization requires a permanent lower class.
A perpetual, non-white class to do all the drudgery so a white aristocracy can flourish.
And this results in what the models call apartheid constitutionalism. How is that different from the Jim Crow era we know?
It's fundamentally different. Jim Crow was separation enforced by local law and custom. This is a national federal system where an entire class of people are legally defined as permanent subjects outside the nation. The Dred Scott decision becomes the bedrock of their entire legal system.
And to maintain that, you need a full-blown terror state.
You do. The constant threat of rebellion with a free nation right next door is an existential crisis. So they build a massive internal security apparatus. The old slave patrols are centralized into a national paramilitary gendarmerie.
Imposing things like pass laws.
Exactly. Similar to South Africa's pass laws to monitor and restrict the movement of the black population, the entire nation essentially becomes a giant open-air prison.
And what about surveillance?
The Confederate Secret Service evolves into a dedicated political police force. Their job is infiltration of slayer communities, of abolitionist networks, and eliminating white dissenters. It's an omnipresent police state.
But the enslaved population is not passive in this. This leads to what the sources call the internal war of guerrillas.
Yes. The enslaved population, many with military experience from the war, would organize mass uprisings. They'd form sustained rural guerrilla forces, targeting infrastructure, plantations, government officials. They have nothing to lose.
So the Underground Railroad that we know?
It transforms. It's no longer just about civil aid. It becomes a militarized clandestine network, covertly supported by Union intelligence. You have armed cross-border liberation raids to free slaves or strike CSA infrastructure.
And these raids are the constant source of diplomatic crises.
Constantly pushing the two nations to the brink of a second war. The CSA lives in a permanent state of danger.
Okay, so if we connect all this tension to the bigger picture, the separation forces both nations down radically divergent economic paths.
Which sets them up for an inevitable continental clash. It's driven by trade, resources, and imperial expansion.
Let's start with the North. It's ironic, but losing the South actually seems to turbocharge its industrial potential.
Absolutely. The Union is suddenly liberated from the legislative opposition of the Southern planter class. Congress immediately implements this aggressive Hamiltonian economic agenda.
We're talking extreme protectionism.
Exactly. High tariffs are erected, protecting American industry from cheap British competition. It accelerates the industrialization of New England and the Midwest decades earlier than in our timeline.
And they treat things like railroads as a national security issue.
Crucially, the Transcontinental Railroad becomes a massive security priority, built specifically to secure California and its mineral wealth against the CSA. Logistics, standardization, centralization, That becomes the focus. By the 1890s, Chicago and New York are global financial centers rivaling London.
Now, contrast that with the South. Their whole bet on King Cotton turns out to be a fatal miscalculation.
The sources call it the monoculture trap. King Cotton diplomacy backfires spectacularly. Britain helped them win, sure, but then Britain immediately diversifies its cotton sources to India and Egypt to avoid being blackmailed in the future.
So the global price of cotton plummets.
It drives prices down steeply. The projections are that by the early 1900s, the Southern economy would be destitute.
And they can't just pivot to industry.
They try, but their whole social structure works against it. The planter elite fears concentrating enslaved people in cities. It facilitates organization and revolt. Plus, to please their British allies, they adopt a free trade policy, which makes them a captive market for British goods and stifles any local industry.
And this weakness drives the next big conflict, the race for the West.
Since they can't compete industrially, they have to expand territorially. So the far west becomes the immediate conflict zone, the bleeding border. The CSA unilaterally maintains the Confederate territory of Arizona south of the 34th parallel.
Their goal is to reach the Pacific.
Reach the gold mines of California and, most importantly, gain a Pacific port to break the Union's continental trade monopoly.
And the Union responds by setting up a rival territory right next door.
Precisely. The USA establishes its own Arizona territory further north, explicitly prohibiting slavery, and the land between them becomes this militarized zone. The West, in this timeline, is much more savage, full of low-intensity guerrilla warfare over resources.
Like a decades-long proxy war.
Very much so, yeah.
So blocked in the West, the Confederacy turns its focus south to the old imperial dream of the Golden Circle.
Exactly. The vision of a Caribbean slave empire centered on Havana becomes official Confederate policy. They rebuild their navy with European ironclads and start pressuring the crumbling Spanish Empire.
And they actually succeed in acquiring Cuba.
The model suggests that in the 1870s or 80s, through a war or a purchase, the CSA gets Cuba. This is huge for them. It revitalizes their slave-based sugar economy and gives them massive leverage in the Caribbean.
And what about Mexico, where France is trying to prop up Emperor Maximiliano?
The CSA becomes Maximiliano's main backer. They send troops and weapons, and in exchange for this crucial support, they negotiate the cession of large Mexican states like Sonora and Chihuahua.
Sonora and Chihuahua, why those?
The Pacific outlet. It finally ensures the CSA gets a deep water port at Guaymas. It achieves their long-sought goal of breaking the Union's grip on trans-Pacific trade. The great irony, of course, is that the CSA, founded on states' rights, immediately embraces the most aggressive, centralizing, imperial foreign policy on the continent.
So we enter the 20th century with two hostile, heavily armed nations dominating North America. What happens when the global tensions that led to World War I hit? The Monroe Doctrine is just dead.
It's null and void. North America is now fully integrated into the European system of rival alliances. Two permanent opposed blocs form across the world.
So let's define them.
On one side, you have the Entente, that's Great Britain and France, aligned with the CSA. The Confederacy is their vital overseas client, a source of raw materials and a market for their goods. The Royal Navy basically guarantees the CSA's maritime security.
And the USA, surrounded by enemies, has to find allies among London's rivals.
Which leads to the Alliance Central. The USA aligns with a newly unified Germany. There's a mutual admiration for their high-speed industrialization and military efficiency. And the U.S. also deepens its historic friendship with Imperial Russia, which also hates the British Empire.
So when World War I starts in Europe, it starts in America at the same time.
Absolutely. The war is fought on North American soil. The analysis suggests a brutal trench war along the Virginia and Maryland border, mirroring the Western Front. At the same time, the U.S. would launch a massive invasion of British Canada to cut supply lines.
And the outcome of this great American war would come down to industrial capacity.
It's highly probable that the overwhelming industrial might of the USA and Germany would crush the agrarian CSA, unless there was total British naval intervention in the Atlantic. If the CSA is defeated, you're looking at forced regime change, maybe even reannexation.
But let's assume the CSA survives World War I. Their economy was supposed to be collapsing. But then this massive economic lifeline appears.
The 1901 discovery of massive oil fields at Spindletop, Texas. This is the regime's salvation. Oil replaces King Cotton as the economic engine.
And that wealth prevents any kind of political evolution.
The CSA evolves into an authoritarian Petro-State. The oil money lets the government fund a huge military and police state without needing democratic accountability. They use the oil rents to subsidize the poor white population and fund high-tech repression against the black population.
Now we step into the darkest part of the analysis, World War II.
The absence of a unified U.S. power just severely weakens the Allied cause. The CSA, with its militaristic racial hierarchy, is seen as ideologically friendly to Nazi Germany.
So they might align with the Axis.
They could easily remain neutral and sell oil to Germany and Japan, or even align with them. Southern universities become centers for scientific racism, giving intellectual support to the fascist worldview.
And what does a non-unified U.S. mean for the war effort?
The model suggests that without the full unified industrial force of the U.S., Nazi Germany might have a much better chance in Europe. The Allied output gap against Germany's industrial base just increases dramatically.
And then after the war, the Cold War would look completely different.
A weakened USA, preoccupied with its southern border, can't achieve clear global hegemony. So you get a more multipolar Cold War, maybe with greater Soviet influence right here in North America.
And how does having the CSA next door affect the civil rights struggle in the Union?
The struggle becomes much bloodier and prolonged because the CSA system serves as a powerful, legitimizing example for segregationists in the Union. They can point south and say, see, it works.
But cultural resistance still finds a way.
This is one of the tragic ironies of the scenario. The brutal oppression also fertilizes incredible creativity. The blues and jazz are born not just as expressions of pain, but as coded forms of political resistance.
So the music becomes contraband.
Heavily censored in the South, yeah. But it's smuggled north, where it influences global culture and serves as constant anti-Confederate propaganda to the rest of the world. It's the sound of resistance the state can't silence.
So this all raises a big question. What is the ultimate trajectory of a petro-state founded on forced labor in the late 20th century?
Even with the oil wealth, the analysis points toward an inevitable collapse.
Driven by internal rot.
Yes. The models agree the CSA would not survive indefinitely. The internal pressure, the economic decay once oil becomes less central, and increasing global isolation. It's destined to become a pariah state, like apartheid South Africa. Sanctions would eventually cripple it.
So the system of servitude by contract would eventually have to be dismantled.
Legal abolition would probably happen by the mid-20th century, but it wouldn't be liberation. It would just be replaced by a formal, state-mandated apartheid system that would persist for decades.
And what triggers the final end? The Confederate Spring.
It's most likely an internal implosion. A combination of mass strikes in the oil fields, uprisings in the black belts, and economic crisis, which would lead to a violent overthrow or maybe direct humanitarian intervention by the USA and the UN.
So the analysis confirms that a victory for the South, while altering history and costing millions their freedom, was ultimately not a sustainable model.
Correct. The foundational flaw was moral, but it manifested economically and militarily. The counterfactual demonstrates that the Union victory, as costly as it was the indispensable prerequisite for freedom and modern prosperity. A victory for the South would have created a darker, perpetually militarized world.
That was a rigorous and often sobering deep dive. We traced the transformation of Mason-Dixon line into a fortified border, the evolution of slavery into constitutional apartheid, the scramble for Cuba, and the ultimate destabilization of 2 world wars.
And the profound realization is that even the pragmatic attempts to save the slaves state-like becoming an authoritarian petro-state ultimately failed. It bought them time, but it couldn't buy permanence.
For our final provocative thought for you to consider, think about the fate of manifest destiny in this world. Without a single unified continental goal, the very idea of American identity just fractures. Would the USA, constantly surrounded by enemies, ever have developed the confidence to look outward and become a truly global power? Or would its focus have remained forever fixed on its hostile southern border, a perpetually contained regional power, unable to shape the global order?
A fascinating and profoundly terrifying alternative to ponder.
We'll leave you to mull over that vision of a world turned upside down. Thank you for diving deep with us.